Thank you for joining us here at the First Alert Desk. I am Maria Moreau, joined by our political reporter, Doug Reardon, with the news that if you missed, where have you been? Over the past 12 hours, I want to say, less than actually, President Biden announcing he is ending his presidential campaign, throwing out his endorsement to Kamala Harris, who he hopes will take the mantle and keep running forward in the fight against the Republican candidate for president, former President Donald Trump. We have a lot to get into. A lot has transpired from both sides of the political spectrum. And Doug, you have had quite the week yourself between the Republican National Convention leading up to over this weekend at 1:46 p.m. the announcement on social media, of all places, from the president himself saying he's not going to continue on in this fight.
Yeah, and we expect to hear from Biden in his words sometime in the future, later on next week. He is still battling COVID-19, so he is at his beach house in Rehoboth recovering from that, and so it was all but impossible for him to make any sort of actual statements. But yeah, that letter confirmed what a lot of people have been talking about for many, many weeks now, which is that he is no longer going to be running for president for his reelection bid. And I think it's really important to note a couple things. The most important is that there is no Democratic nominee for president right now. There wasn't going to be officially until after the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in a few weeks anyways. And so what we have now is a scenario where Vice President Kamala Harris appears to be the presumptive nominee. She has been endorsed by Joe Biden, which means there's a very high likelihood she will get the delegates who have pledged to him through that process known as the Electoral College. And she has to earn them, certainly. It's not a given. She is not guaranteed all of the delegates that have already pledged their electoral votes to Biden at next month's convention. And so this is going to look like now a lot of messaging on her end. She's going to be very likely taking a lot of calls with delegates and with state parties and their chairs, and maybe even holding a couple of town halls or actual press events to make sure that she can shore up that support from the delegates before they have to go to the convention floor and vote starting in mid-August. And so this is going to be a very quick moving process for Democrats. They have to make sure that she has support going into this convention. There are, in fact, even deadlines as to where tickets need to be set on ballots in certain states, like Ohio, before the convention actually happens, I believe around August 7th. And so this convention isn't even the deadline. They need to move very quickly to make sure that they have not only a nominee, but also someone in mind to be her running mate, too.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. The message with the Democrats, as we see reaction pour in, and we'll share some of that reaction with you in a moment, is this call for unity for the Democratic Party to essentially be on the same page about this. And a lot of questions remain unanswered, including who will be Vice President Kamala Harris's vice president if she does secure this nomination. I do want to play this story that we've put together on that subject specifically, because there are some names that are being thrown out, including some right here in Georgia.
I, Kamala Davy Harris, solemnly swear.
Vice President Kamala Harris, poised to make history once again, endorsed by President Joe Biden as his pick to replace him come November.
Are you ready to make your voices heard?
The 59-year-old went from prosecutor to California Attorney General, then Senator in 2016, before making her first bid for the White House, later tapped by Joe Biden as his running mate. As vice president, she's been tasked with leading the administration's efforts to address migration at the southern border, making her a top target for Republicans. Also leading the administration's charge on reproductive rights. Now, swing state voters are reacting to news she could be the party's Democratic nominee.
I think people don't realize how strong she is, and I think she's come a long way in the last couple of years.
I don't know if people have been really thinking about her in that way, so yeah, it's hard to say. And I guess it would depend who she chose as her running mate.
Harris, who has a more liberal voting record, could be balanced by a more centrist VP pick. Names have started to swirl, including swing state governors like North Carolina's Roy Cooper, Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, and Andy Beshear of Kentucky, who sources say she spoke with on the phone Sunday.
You want to have someone who knows how to govern, who could step into the job.
But Harris's official nomination is not yet a done deal, with Democratic delegates set to vote ahead of the party convention next month. Jared Hill, CBS News.
And talk about how this all started, the momentum around calls for President Biden to drop out started really after his performance at the first presidential debate of 2024 that happened right here in Atlanta, of all places. That really was the starting point for what we're experiencing now, which is this shift within the Democratic Party and having to rally around a new nominee, potentially. Let's talk about that debate, because, Doug, you were there, you covered it extensively. What was the feeling in the room going into this debate and coming out of it?
Yeah, I think it was the breaking point. I think the starting point was way back when Biden first started thinking about running. People were talking about his age, knowing that he would have been going into his second term, the oldest president to ever seek a second term. Obviously, that's not happening now. But once he got to that debate stage in Atlanta, it was not good. There's no other way to put it. He was up there. He was very haltering. He was tripping over his words, forgetting where he was in his talking points. And, you know, in a room full of journalists, when there are audible gasps at points during a presidential debate, you know that's never a good thing. And that is exactly what happened when we were watching that debate in Midtown, right across from CNN studios. And so the debate performance certainly was, I think, everybody's worst fear if you were a Biden supporter. And it certainly was a whole lot of ammunition for the GOP to say, you know, he is not up to this task. Cognitively, he cannot do this for another 4 years. And eventually, that is what his closest aides and a lot of members of his own party started telling him after that night. It began immediately. There were tweets and calls the next day for him to step down, first coming from a Texas representative, Lloyd Doggett. And so the bottom kind of slid out after that. And it really is incredible to think of the centerpiece that Atlanta played in this, having hosted the debate here, that, again, really sparked this conversation about getting serious about trying to find someone new to lead the Democratic Party. So that debate performance is, again, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back there for Biden, and certainly a lot of members of the Democratic Party as well.
I know a lot of people on social media have taken with their own questions. Can this be done? Can the president endorse somebody? Obviously, there's a lot more complexity to having a new nominee at this point in the race. And this is, at least for our lifetimes, unprecedented. This is something that we don't have a clear path or a general understanding of how to navigate. And that's really the situation for the Democrats right now, is having to show that they are a strong force and that they are still a united force in all of this, as they have a big question mark on who ultimately will be the nominee.
Yeah, you're right in saying that this has never happened before. Never before have we had a presidential candidate that's had just about all of their party delegates in the bag and then drop out. You know, we talked to, I think this was an interesting perspective. We talked to the state GOP chair here in Georgia just last night when the news broke, Josh McCoon, and he used the word conned. He said that these Democratic voters were conned because you go into a primary voting for a candidate and you put your vote down, you expect that person, or you at least hope that person will win. And when you do, and then they drop out, that is kind of taking away the voice that you have used at the ballot box. And so I think that among Republicans, there's a strong sentiment, certainly, that these Democratic voters were kind of robbed of their voice there at the ballot box. We asked Democratic Party chairwoman here in Georgia, Nikema Williams, who is also a congresswoman for our state, you know, about that, and said, hey, listen, you know, people who voted for Joe Biden must feel a little disappointed now that he's not on the ticket, now that their vote essentially doesn't count. And she said, no, you know, our voters vote for a ticket. Kamala Harris's name was on that ticket. It was on that ballot. They could see it right then and there. And she said, this is what happens. We have a contingency plan in the United States. You have a vice president so that if things like this happen, you know that you have voted for someone who will leave you in good hands. And so I don't think the Democrats really see this as a con or a dupe of their voters, but certainly the GOP does. And we are going to talk to delegates a little later on in the day just to kind of find out, you know, where are they at? Where are they thinking? They also pledged their support. Not only did they vote for President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, they have literally pledged their support on behalf of Democratic voters in the state to them. And so I suspect that there may be a little bit of hurt feelings there among the Democrats, but it doesn't matter because they have to pivot right now. They have to figure out who they're going to put on the top of the ticket. And so, you know, this is why we have primaries. This is the latest in the process that a sitting president has ever dropped out after they have gotten all of the delegates. And so that we have never seen before. But this is also why we have conventions. Keep in mind, there was no official nominee. Despite Biden having got these delegates, it was basically them saying, hey, listen, when the time comes, we're going to cast a vote for you. It wasn't necessarily a sure thing. It wasn't in the bag. He wasn't a confirmed nominee. In fact, Donald Trump wasn't the confirmed nominee of the Republican Party until just last Monday, a week ago from today, when the delegates went to Milwaukee, took the floor, and did their roll call vote state by state to cast their votes for former President Donald Trump as their nominee. And so this is what we have conventions for. This is what they used to be before we had a really solidified primary and caucus process in this country. So this is kind of old school. We're going to go back to the convention floor. There could be some debate, even though it is widely anticipated that Vice President Kamala Harris will all but absorb every single one of those delegates' votes. But there certainly could be debate, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing, sketchy about that. This is the way that it used to work, and now it's going to be the way it's got to work again this time around.
Let's talk about the GOP for a moment. You were in Milwaukee for the Republican National Convention. You saw the energy flowing, the rallying around former President Donald Trump as he accepted the nomination. And now Republicans are reacting to this just as everybody else is, and House Republicans even going as far as to say that President Biden, if he isn't confident in himself to run for re-election, he ultimately should resign right now, immediately, I believe was the words that were being used.
Yeah, and State Party Chair McCoon told us that last night. He said, look, if Biden is not cognitively able enough to finish his campaign, then he's not cognitively able enough to finish his term as president. I don't think that Joe Biden is going to step down. That would create a true constitutional crisis in our country, given that his vice president is currently the de facto nominee at this point. And so that would be hard to see, but this was hard to see as well, so you never know. But a lot of Republicans are making that call for Biden to step aside, saying, look, if you can't handle a campaign, how are you going to handle the most difficult job in the world for essentially another year plus? And so we have heard that call from the state party chair. I've heard it and seen it from a lot of Republicans online. And so you can expect those calls to keep coming, certainly. But there is nothing that says Biden has to step aside just because he has abandoned his re-election bid.
Given that Kamala Harris is front and center right now for this forthcoming nomination. She hasn't necessarily secured it at this point. There's still a lot of question around who it will be. What, in your opinion, being locked in on this political world that we're navigating through, would it take for another name to build as much momentum as she is created? I mean, she's garnered over nearly $49 million
Right.
Since the announcement that Biden was dropping out for support for herself. She's seeing some significant rallying around her as the nominee. I guess, given the other names that we're hearing, do they have a realistic chance at this?
Yeah, well, you ask what it would take. I think at this point, the only thing it would take is money. Here's the thing. The delegates don't automatically belong to Vice President Kamala Harris, but what does automatically belong to her are the Biden-Harris campaign funds. Her name is on that campaign, and so those funds do belong to that ticket as it was previously set. Those don't belong to anyone else. Essentially, the Democratic Party, say they were to nominate someone like Gavin Newsom or someone like Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's been talked about as an unlikely candidate, but talked about nonetheless. They would have to start essentially from scratch. As you mentioned, Kamala Harris was able to raise almost $50 million over the course of a few hours last night. And so, I think that shows the fundraising power that her name and that this administration has behind it as a coalition between her and Biden. But also, B, it shows that this will be much easier on the DNC without having to navigate some really sticky campaign finance procedures in order to get her the funding that she needs. Presidential races are expensive. Sometimes state Senate races are expensive. You're talking multi-million-dollar races. And so money kind of talks when it comes to these things. And so if that money in the Biden-Harris campaign fund belongs to her, she is even more the obvious choice for this, because you have that massive war chest now, even bigger over the last 24 hours than it was before. And so it only makes sense for Harris to kind of step in and be able to use that as nobody else can.
I want to get into some of this reaction that we're seeing on social media, starting with our very own mayor right here in Atlanta, Andre Dickens. taking to Twitter, where we saw the president put out his letter across social media, but Mayor Dickens throwing his support out to President Biden, saying President Biden is an extraordinary American who has dedicated his entire life to working people. His incredible record on jobs, the economy, climate, reproductive rights, and his leadership on the world stage make him one of the most consequential leaders in history. Atlanta is stronger because of his leadership. Our nation is better off because of his service, and I'm proud to call him friend, leader, and most of all, president. Now, the mayor went on to post a picture of himself, Vice President Kamala Harris, and the president, and essentially said, let's go, which wasn't a direct endorsement, but fair to conclude that he has his support behind Vice President Kamala Harris, as do many of the Democratic leaders. But I wanted to focus the attention on Atlanta here, as Georgia as a battleground state. This message from Andre Dickens, a Democrat, very much in line with many other Democrats who have thrown their support.
Yeah, and that picture, I think, kind of is important, too. I'm glad you pulled that up. That is him meeting Kamala Harris on the tarmac for one of her many visits. She's been here about half a dozen times at least since the beginning of the year, and almost every single time Dickens has met her on the tarmac. And so he's got a very cozy relationship with the Biden-Harris administration and with the campaign itself, which he holds an advisory role for the Biden-Harris campaign, which I guess we're going to have to change our thinking and start calling it the Harris campaign until there is another name attached to it officially. But yeah, Dickens served in an advisory campaign role for the Biden-Harris campaign, and so he is in very clear support of this administration. I expect, and we do have some time lined up with him, if I'm not mistaken, today to ask him about this, but I suspect that he will likely keep that campaign advisory role and throw his full endorsement behind Vice President Kamala Harris. There isn't really anyone else I can see him endorsing, given his past relationship, not only with the administration itself, but with Harris herself.
On the other side of that, I do want to show this from Burt Jones, the lieutenant governor for Georgia, saying the Democrat establishment has succeeded in subverting the will of their voters. They can replace their nominee, but can't change the damage they've done to this border and economy. Republicans have never been more united, and the Democrats are a mess. See you in November. So obviously for the Republicans, they are reacting to this just as much. And not really embracing Kamala, and that's to be expected. They are throwing their full support and really sending the message that the Democratic Party is not in a place that they can lead the voters, and really calling out this important part of the primaries. The primaries went really to Joe Biden, and now we're calling on those voters and those delegates to rally behind another nominee.
Yeah, and again, Party Chairwoman Nikema Williams told us last night that, you vote for a ticket, Harris's name was right there. Voters could see that. Voters knew that there was a contingency plan if something like this were to happen. Say Biden were to withdraw from the presidency. It would be Biden, by order of the Constitution, who would step in and fill those seats. And so I don't think anyone should be surprised that her name is the one that's floating up the most. I don't think Republicans should be surprised that her name is the one that's floating up the most. If we want to talk about, subverting the voters and taking away their will, that's a perfectly fine conversation to have. But nobody should be surprised that Harris is the name that ended up floating to the top here. She was on the ticket with him. Like I said, if he were to end his presidency today, she would be commander-in-chief without ever having to collect a single vote. And that has happened before. We look at Gerald Ford. He was never elected to the vice presidency. He was never elected to the office of presidency. He made his way to both of those roles through resignations and through scandal. And so, the Constitution, and I know we have Josh Schiffer here in a moment who's going to talk a little bit about this, but the Constitution does spell out things like this in a certain sense. Obviously, that's the context is it's outside of an election, but I think Republicans really do seem focused on just running this race. Even Josh McCoon, the party chair, told us last night, it doesn't matter at all who that candidate is that's going to run against former President Trump. They think that he enjoys enough support here in Georgia and across the country to beat, no matter who the candidate is, to beat whoever that person ends up being. And the one thing that I've heard from both Democrats and Republicans that should be very reassuring for people, if that's the case, is they're telling me it's about the issues. It doesn't matter the candidates are who the candidates are going to be, but it's about the issues. We heard a lot about immigration at the GOP conference, the RNC this week. We heard a lot about the economy. We heard a lot about the military and safety and American foreign policy. And so during the DNC, there certainly is going to be a little more fanfare around picking the nominee and trying to figure out who this is. But I do believe them when they tell me that, they're going to make this an issues-based campaign. The other thing, too, that is maybe a little maddening for Republicans is you had someone sitting across from you who you were running against that had a presidential record. They had served almost a full term as commander-in-chief, as Donald Trump had done. And so there was a lot of fodder for them there to say, hey, this guy has been president for 3 years. Here are the problems that have come out of his presidency. You can't do that anymore. Harris, certainly, while she has served in a White House role, she's second in command. She's no slouch, and she definitely is, a high-ranking public official. She hasn't been president before, and so you can't really hold her feet to the fire on any sort of presidential record. On top of the fact that it also kind of takes away that really boogeyman issue of age for them. You can't throw that stone without hitting the glass house now if you're the GOP, because Donald Trump is significantly older than Kamala Harris. And of course, what started all this? Joe Biden's age, Joe Biden's cognition. And so that card is kind of off the table for Republicans. But I'm told by officials in that party that they are not going to change their race. They're not going to change their messaging points. This is just going to be simply something that there is just a new face across the table from them, and they're going to continue to stick to their messaging as they have.
Let's talk about Kamala Harris as a choice. I mean, you said yourself, age is out. She's 59 years old. She's a former senator, so she has a lot of political experience under her belt. She's also the former attorney general in California. Given that she is under a microscope now, and really she was during the bid with Biden initially back in 2020, what do you foresee haunting her from her past, either as Attorney General and some of the actions she's taken in her political career that will now be on the forefront once again in front of voters as they possibly have to decide in November between her and former President Donald Trump?
There are a number of things, and I think they all go back to her time as Attorney General and as a prosecutor. It's been well publicized that she had been heavily criticized for prosecuting small drug offense crimes when she was in California, putting people away for things that in some cases are now legal in that state. And so, you had former President Donald Trump passing the First Step Act, which was legislation meant to aid people who had been convicted of misdemeanor small crimes to get back into society. It was cheered by a lot of people who traditionally are liberal and progressive because it was criminal justice reform that was in a lot of ways very meaningful for a lot of people, a lot of families to be kept together and not putting people in jail for years on end for small offenses. Those were offenses that Vice President Harris had prosecuted when she was in California. And so you can expect that the GOP will certainly message off that and say, you're not really about progressive culture here. You prosecuted these small crimes and are now trying to make up for it. That's certainly going to be a big talking point for her. But her background as a prosecutor and as Attorney General certainly could help her. I mean, consider the fact that she is running against a convicted felon. She's a prosecutor. There is no greater foil than someone who is in law enforcement for all intents and purposes and someone who has been convicted of a crime. And so we know that former President Donald Trump dropped out of the debate on September 7th. I do hope that they get up on stage and eventually debate because I think that that's what I would be most looking forward to seeing is how does that dynamic of crime, criminal prosecution, how does that all tie together between Harris's maybe checkered past with small crimes convictions and things of that nature and Donald Trump's very recent criminal past where he was convicted on almost 24 more than criminal counts in New York. So I think that if anything comes back to haunt her, it's her past as a prosecutor. I think if anything comes in to help her, it's her past as a prosecutor.
That's a very good answer, and one that we'll have to continue to monitor closely. Doug, I know that as our Atlanta News First political reporter, we are keeping you busy this whole week with this coverage, really for the past several weeks at this point. I do want to ask, you are going to be at the Democratic National Convention August 19th. There's going to be a lot of national attention around this, especially now that it's become more unpredictable on who this nominee is going to be. Walk us through the timeline or what your general predictions are between now and August 19th, the start of the Democratic National Convention.
Yeah. I'll never give a prediction again. I just won't do it. But I'll tell you what I'm looking forward to. You know, on day one of the Republican National Convention, within hours of the convention floor opening up, Donald Trump was confirmed as a nominee. Sometimes they'll wait a day or two, maybe even until the end of the convention to do that if there is some debate over who the candidate is. That hasn't happened in a while. But I want to see how long it takes delegates to actually get on the same page here at the convention and confirm this. Keep in mind, before Biden had dropped out, they were talking about doing an early roll call of delegates and trying to shore up all their votes so that they could get Biden on the ticket in several states whose deadlines were ahead of the start of the DNC to secure their ballots and make sure that all the names were on it and everything like that. And so maybe that's something that Democrats will consider doing down the road here in the very near future, is holding a virtual roll call of their delegates so that we know who the nominee will be going into the convention. That wouldn't be unprecedented, but it certainly would be interesting because we know that time is of the essence here. And so any seconds even that they could save on nominating the right person to fill this role is going to be crucial. And so whether they do it before the convention, sometime at the beginning of the convention, or sometime towards the end of the convention is going to be very telling of how much support Harris actually has. And so that's what I'm looking for over the next couple of days, is what is the chatter there and how are delegates feeling. And we're actually about to go talk to a few right now, so I'm very interested to hear it right from their mouths.
And you were here yesterday. You spoke with a political expert analyzing really this news and what is to come. That's the big question for everyone, is what's next, and that is what we will continue to be following. I want to play that for everybody right now. And of course, we will continue to follow your coverage today and onward this week as you stay on this story. Doug, thank you so much. I do want to throw it out now to the conversation you had with Kennesaw State professor Dr. Ben Taylor.
The total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol.
It all started right here in Atlanta.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence.
With a poor debate performance that weeks later has shaken up the race for president.
Well, it's a black swan event.
Dr. Ben Taylor with Kennesaw State University says delegates already pledged to Joe Biden through primaries and caucuses don't automatically belong to presumptive nominee Vice President Kamala Harris. She still has to earn them.
Now they will be open, the process will be opened up, and they will be able to vote their conscience.
That nominating process will happen at next month's Democratic National Convention. Ahead of that, there could be a series of town halls or meetings with delegates to shore up support for Harris. The VP, who's made half a dozen stops to Georgia since the beginning of the year, may have Republicans on their heels. She's a vastly different candidate than Biden, and the central question of age doesn't work for the GOP anymore.
They will have to go back to the drawing board on that. They will have to go back to the drawing board on their entire strategy in some sense.
This is the latest. A sitting president has dropped out of a race, and with less than 1 month until their convention and only 4 months until the election for Democrats.
Whatever happens has to happen very quickly.
The total.
Apologies, that report from our Doug Reardon. And that next to me, obviously, is not Doug Reardon.
He's far handsomer than me.
It is attorney at law Josh Schiffer. Josh, you are a regular here at this point with us, but I wanted to bring you on, of course, to have this important conversation, not only surrounding this unprecedented news that we're following, but to help answer the question of what is next, because a lot of legal challenges are still to be expected, and a lot of question around constitutional law, the limitations and what is allowed is still on the table. Now, you are a criminal defense attorney, but you have extensively studied this side of the law. For the people that are just meeting you for the first time out there, if you can give us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, actually, law was kind of a second career for me. My original studies were all in politics, political theory, postmodern issues, international relations, international development, the development and comparison of political systems. And I'm just a born natural politics junkie. I was the kid in the neighborhood. My parents got both the morning paper in Atlanta and the afternoon paper in Atlanta before they combined. And politics is sports as far as I'm concerned. This situation that we're facing, we're out of words. There is nothing precedential that we can really go back and rely on when we're talking about some of the novel issues that we are facing as a nation for the very first time. And that's going to be a fantastic process to watch evolve. Speaking from the kind of just general conversation, we're hearing all kinds of claims coming out from all sides about what's going to happen next, what can happen next, what's illegal and is never going to happen next. And I ask everybody to slow down your roll for the very first couple of days, because everybody's finding their footing. Bringing a claim, bringing a complaint, filing some sort of petition, that's really easy. Now, some of those are going to be valid, but remember, a lot of the arguments that we're hearing tossed out are speculative in nature. I've personally been sent all kinds of questions about, can she run? What happens now? Let me tell you that the system is prepared for a lot of this, and I'll clear up a couple misconceptions right now. Will Kamala Harris appear on all 50 states' ballots? Almost guaranteed yes. The Democrat National Convention has not occurred yet. Ballots aren't printed. There's an enormous amount of space to cover from the Democrat Party when it comes to bringing forth their candidate. So it would be unheard of for whoever the Democrats nominate to not make it on the state ballots. So please don't get lost in the idea that there's some sort of fatal error in the process that's going to prevent her from being listed as a candidate if she is so selected, which it really appears she's going to be by all intents and purposes. So far, everybody from the Democrat establishment side has basically gathered forces behind Kamala Harris and is working dutifully on a unity ticket. Meanwhile, we're going to see some people start to really turn up their complaints against her as the heir apparent to the Joe Biden presidency. Foremost among those are people who are going to complain from the progressive left that we are bringing in a Democrat candidate who has a long history of running state prosecution authorities. Lots of people are concerned about the criminal, or about the management of the California prison system, one of the largest prison systems in the nation. Kamala Harris's experience as an executive in California as the Attorney General. She is a dyed-in-the-wool prosecutor and has been since the very beginning of her career. That's an issue that Joe Biden was faced with from his progressive wing on Joe Biden's hawkish anti-crime, pro-law and order positions. Kamala Harris comes out a lot of that same background, being brought up in a criminal justice system. I know a lot of people are fascinated with the idea of a former DA eventually becoming the president. So she is going to face some pushback from the far left. However, as a big alternative to the genocide Joe chant from the progressive left, that it's going to ameliorate some of that because Kamala Harris doesn't have some of the national baggage that Joe Biden has been carrying. But there are so many issues to get lost in. I beg you all to just slow down a little bit, listen to authoritative sources, and then figure out whether that rumor is true.
Well, hey, while we're talking about misconceptions, because we have seen some questions floating around social media, one of which was people asking, Joe Biden secured pretty much all of his primaries, all of his caucuses, I would say, except for the territory of American Samoa. It naturally should, the delegates have called for him. So to bring in another nominee that has to then earn all of those delegates right back, it doesn't happen with him as simply posting to social media saying, hey, let's rally around Kamala Harris. Some people took to social media asking, well, shouldn't it go to the other Democratic nominees who were listed in the primaries, given that those other two names only secured 3 to 5 delegates. So very different from the 3,900 plus that President Joe Biden had secured within these delegates. Let's talk about the campaign laws here, or the constitutional laws for that matter, the president can endorse Kamala Harris, and he probably has heavy influence with the Democratic Party to rally around her, but that doesn't mean she's secured the nomination. What does it mean if other Democrats now want to throw their names out and really stand against the direction the president has set the party?
You're touching on one of the big issues that's boiling beneath the surface of this rejuvenated Democrat Party, which is the fact that by President Biden stepping back, thoroughly endorsing and encouraging everyone else to endorse and get behind his Vice President Kamala Harris, the voters did not get to pick Kamala Harris directly, and no one has voted for Kamala Harris in this position prior to the Democratic convention. Everybody just assumed that it was going to be Biden. So there's a very strong ethic that there should be choice among the Democrats, and that by pushing Kamala Harris so aggressively, it's an authoritarian move to disenfranchise Democrat voters. I don't believe there's a straight-faced answer to that that's going to solve or really ameliorate people who are upset that for all intents and purposes, the Democrat Party establishment, led by Joe Biden, and the big Democrat donors selected Kamala Harris to be the Democrat nominee for president. That is anti-democratic in many ways. I believe so as well, and would have preferred a robust primary process, a process that it doesn't appear we're going to have, although it still could, as you noted. Other Democrats can step up. There were rumors that Joe Manchin was considering that possibility, despite him leaving the Democrat Party officially. But it is absolutely possible for other Democrat politicians to stand up and ask to be counted, position themselves as creating some sort of a race. I just don't think it's very likely. The powerful, influential individuals within Democrat politics are doing everything possible to snip off the extraneous frizzy hairs and create a unity ticket behind Kamala Harris and her eventual vice presidential choice.
Let's talk about the Republican side of this. I mean, their reaction is just as valid as any of the Democratic reaction we have seen. Republicans, House Republicans, just in the past less than 12 hours, have called Biden to resign if he wasn't confident enough to run for re-election. Others have said that they are going to look into legal action that they can take because raising the concerns because voters didn't have a say in this nominee. What legal challenges do you expect to see, if any, come between now and the start of the Democratic National Convention?
I won't be surprised if there are legal actions taken to try to frustrate, stymie, and prevent Kamala Harris's name from appearing on local ballots to be filed in many states. Typically, in national elections, there are numerous challenges that basically don't reach the light of day. And I expect those to be in force, and we're probably going to get some more creative ones as different groups within the political spectrum on both sides try to disrupt a process that appears to have all the inertia it needs to cement Kamala Harris as the Democrat nominee against former President Trump. Whether any of those state-specific challenges manifest into something that actually halts, that would be an emergency issue, and most or all states have some sort of process to clean that up and ensure that elections take place. But obviously, election integrity is at play within this election cycle. Donald Trump has made a major platform for his race on election integrity, the idea that the prior election was stolen from him. Any hiccups, any odd occurrences, any challenge that is not thoroughly fleshed out within the states regarding who appears on the ballot will feed the supporters of President Trump, former President Trump, when it comes to the legitimacy issues as the Democrats try to tamp down those issues, likely using transparency and party unity.
Now, with all of this being considered, you know, the Republicans taking this opportunity to highlight and put a spotlight on how disorganized the Democratic Party is. You said something to me, actually, before we jumped on here, because what we've seen across social media is concerns about whether the Democrats are going to get it together in time to still have a running chance. A lot of people saying Trump has basically got it in the bag now, which is speculative. We still have months to go until the November election. But you said something interesting, and that was wait for the final 30 days.
Yeah, I'm very firmly believe that big national elections and even state elections are won in that last 30 days. All the period, and this is the longest presidential campaign in United States history. It basically never stopped after Joe Biden won the election. The arguments to the base are just chum that keeps an ecosystem of politics and political discussion alive. And it's how we explore the various political issues that happen day to day. And the vast majority of American voters are pretty set in their voting patterns. They fall broadly into left and right paradigms. What's argued about, what's argued about and advocated for and trying to influence is that center 10, 15, 20%. With as close as elections have been both in the United States and internationally, we face a more polarized world than ever. And in the United States, we've now seen elections come down to the most bare of margins. So when looking at who's going to win, how you win elections, it comes down to the granularity of a few points here and a few points there, because that's also where a politician can really effectively move their needle by addressing directly special interest groups. There's a lot of discussion on the Democrat side that by appointing Kamala Harris, they're going to tamp down the anti-Joe Biden movement on the far progressive left, specifically involved in the Palestine and Israel issue. On the right, you see some of these issues with religion, a lot of argument over the abortion issue being either less or more important in a post-Dobbs world. So that last 30 days, that last 5-10% of voters whose minds are still in play and who, whether they vote or not, becomes a big question. Voter apathy and staying home becomes a major focus of different campaigns, and that's why you will see a get out the vote effort in that last 30 days, knowing that it's not necessarily who you're going to vote for, but who shows up and actually votes determines who carries a state, especially a state as closely watched as Georgia. Remember, Georgia has gone back and forth on the political spectrum dramatically over the last 5-10 years, from a far, firm, triple red state to then fairly purple, with a lot of traditional conservative communities trending more progressive. But then we've had a snap back under a very strong state Republican governor, Governor Kemp, who has an independent track record as part of the crowd that doesn't necessarily embrace Donald Trump but supports it. And Georgia has, in recent estimations, become more firmly red due to Joe Biden's performance. How that changes with Kamala Harris coming aboard, well, the first thing that people are going to draw comparisons to is Stacey Abrams and her gubernatorial campaign, because it carried many themes that I feel Kamala Harris is going to adopt, specifically empowering some of these demographics that don't traditionally have as loud a voice as they would like. And I'm speaking directly about the African American woman contingent, which is going to be a major focus of the Kamala Harris campaign, as this demographic can motivate voters who otherwise don't vote. That's the last 30 days. The last 30 days is when we're going to have the October surprises of major policy shifts. The last 30 days is when we could see huge movement on national issues such as gun control, marijuana policy, abortion rights. It's where you're going to see both candidates attempt strong positional messaging in order to squeeze that last 1, 2, or 3% of voters over into their column.
Let's talk about the voters for a minute, because I'm glad you brought up Georgia specifically. Still a battleground state and will be at the forefront between now and November, and even past November. The voters and this idea that that several Republicans have raised of any nominee that was not chosen by these delegates during the primary and during the caucuses is illegitimate. That's the argument that some Republicans are making. Is there any legal backing to that? And could we see this possibly make it up to the Supreme Court, these legal challenges?
I don't feel that there's a single legitimate challenge to Kamala Harris appearing on the ballot, just like there's not a single legitimate challenge to former President Trump appearing on the Georgia ballot. In fact, our state election heads and our gurus, the Gabe Sterlings of the universe, have come out and said that there aren't going to be any issues with Kamala Harris appearing on the ballot, despite, remonstrations from the Georgia Republicans saying that she's not going to be a legitimate candidate and focusing in on the problems with her eventual nomination, that she wasn't chosen by voters, but more selected by President Biden and the Democrat establishment, notably big money donors who very publicly dried up and were refusing to support Joe Biden's attempt to run.
What do you say to the folks that are taking a look at some of the other names that have been brought up? If it wasn't Kamala Harris as the ultimate nominee, I mean, we hear some names like Governor Gavin Newsom of California, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, who was a contender, as well as the current Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. We even have Governor Raphael Warnock on this list of names of possible replacements for Joe Biden in the running. Obviously, Vice President Kamala Harris having the most momentum from the president's endorsement, but these names are not out of the question. These Democrats themselves, if they were to pursue this and to build up their own momentum, legally speaking, what happens with the Democratic National Convention and these delegates going forward with a nominee that is ultimately not Harris?
With a deep bench, which the Democrats do have a deep bench of second-tier national-level politicians. What they lack at the top end, they have in droves, one step down. So there's a number of people that could very well try to disrupt this process. That's why what we've seen from the Harris campaign, from President Biden, is a very strong and deliberate attempt to circle everyone up, get them behind a unity ticket, and prevent anyone from standing up and being that sore loser at the convention. So I don't believe anyone with a future in Democrat politics has the gumption to stand up to the National Democrat Party, especially given the unique dynamics that we see right now. This has never happened before. The odds of it happening again are extraordinarily slim. I foresee some attempts to regulate presidents, mental health issues. There's all kinds of things that we're going to argue about in Congress over the next couple of decades after these two older gentlemen are done with their service. But I don't foresee a Democrat organized effort to unseat Kamala Harris taking any real steps forward on a national scene, even though they will have to discuss it, because to not discuss the appointment of Kamala Harris as the candidate is disingenuous to the Democrat base. And the Democrat base is already coming out fairly angry about feeling they've been misled by the Democrats, that they've been misled by Democrat politicians who've spent the last several months assuring everyone of the health, vitality, and strength of President Biden. That obviously puts egg on the face of many people, and I feel there will be a pushback from voters who feel that they have been misled by some national figures. I don't know if that's going to be enough to actually move the needle on a Harris president or a Harris nomination, but there is certainly going to be a lot of discussion regarding reform of the candidacy process and how to deal with this again in the future.
You know, taking a look at Kamala Harris as the potential nominee for all of this, we spoke with our political reporter, Doug Reardon, who said her greatest weakness under the microscope is going to be her time as Attorney General. She's had significant critiques through some of the prosecutorial work that she did during that time. and also her greatest strength is going to be that she was a prosecutor, that she was in this legal world, in contrast to Trump, who is a convicted felon. What is your opinion, coming from the legal world, being immersed in this space, of that statement?
Is it going to add or subtract from her strength as a candidate? It's going to do both. What people or how people value her experience, I don't know if it's going to really attract more voters to her. What it really is going to do is send a message to certain progressive Democrats that she is not worth getting up and voting for, because she has been a state prosecutor basically her entire career. That is a background that a lot of progressive voters find distasteful. It was a problem with Joe Biden, didn't prevent them from getting elected. But from a national perspective, there's a certain slice of Democrats as well as Republicans that are very anti-authority, anti-law enforcement, anti-the system, and those minorities can be extraordinarily loud. Again, this gets back to bringing out the vote, getting voters to actually show up in the ballot box in November, and her background as a prosecutor will offend many voters. I don't believe it sends them over to vote for Donald Trump, but it may keep them at home. So I feel she's going to address that issue directly with some civil rights appointments. I believe she's going to spend a lot of time with civil rights leaders, talking about improving the criminal justice system, changing the tone and tenure of the criminal justice system. Remember, she is also an African American woman. She has a very specific perspective on the role of law and order and criminal justice in the community, and that's going to be a different perspective from the traditional Caucasian, white-dominated male law and order universe that the United States has banked on for the last 50 years in order to generate votes. So that's going to be a fairly fascinating intersection. I know from a policy and ideology standpoint, a number of intellectual lefties are very concerned about her pathway to power, who has been involved, what she has or has not done, and I'm not hearing a lot of support other than she's not Donald Trump and will be a better candidate than Joe Biden from intellectual left-leaning individuals due to her fidelity to a system that has spun out horrific results. The California prison system is rife with fundamental problems involving human rights, war crimes, fairness, fundamental justice issues that are rife in the nation's largest criminal justice system, a system she had a direct role in controlling. That is a ripe target for the right. I believe the right is going to basically try to trash her using the California penal system as leverage for that. They're going to use her positions on firearms and gun control in order to motivate the Second Amendment slice of the right. That's going to be a very effective tactic outside of California, where Second Amendment issues do move votes. There's a lot of different issues at play with how to get people out of their chairs and into a voting booth during that last 30 days.
Well, let's talk about not only the last 30 days, really what's next between now and November. That is where everyone's attention now goes, is what does the future look like between, talking about policy and legal action. What are the next steps for both campaigns?
Donald Trump's campaign is going to continue to focus on his track record from his presidency, highlighting the issues that he feels motivates voters the most, very specifically the border and immigration. Kamala Harris was a major liaison for President Biden on border issues that have been a problem for the left and remain a problem nationally. That's kind of red meat for the Republican campaign. The flood of undocumented immigrants, employment issues, they've become very outspoken regarding the idea that former President Trump is going to begin mass deportations of undocumented. That is a line that gets a lot of visceral response from grassroots Republicans as well as some people on the left. The jobs angle tries to target lower income individuals who are frustrated with a system that is leaving them behind due to runaway inflation. The economic policies of Joe Biden versus the economic policies of Trump and Trump voters will remain a focus. Trump has brought up his interest in aggressive tariffs, some isolation, some very strong worker protections for American workers that the left, which traditionally is more free trade or has been very more free trade and equal trade based, worries will disrupt the international economy and the balance of power. So the immigration and trade issues will become a major focus. The Harris campaign is going to spend this week polishing off the organization that was probably started behind the scenes several weeks ago. The money has been transferred. I read a document this morning filed with the FEC regarding Kamala Harris now being in charge of the newly formed campaign. There's about $200 million there that now she will directly control as opposed to sending it to a super PAC or the National Democrat Party. That again indicates how fully behind the Democrat establishment is with her campaign. They're not even going to pretend to share that money with other candidates. There's just so many different angles that are going to be coming about in this next week, all before the Democrat convention, a convention that may appear to be open, even though everyone understands that Kamala Harris has been selected by the establishment leadership and they intend to install her as the Democrat candidate for president to replace Joe Biden. Whether there's a pushback and what that pushback looks like, that's yet to be determined. The Democrat convention has been the scene of substantial disruption and even violence previously. So this is not all settled, and there are some people that are going to insist on being heard with their positions at the convention.
Josh Schiffer, I always appreciate your time when you're able to join us here on Atlanta News First Plus. For the voters out there, you know, we hear from political experts saying, for the most part, people have their party loyalties, but this has brought attention to a new potential nominee, and voters will have the ultimate decision on whether they want to stick with the Democratic Party and stick with this new nominee who, at the beginning of the year, no one was expecting. So for the voters out there, what are the main things that they need to be watching out for in the coming months?
The big issues are going to be the prominent national positions aren't going to change as much as people believe. We understand who the conservative branch of our government is. We understand who the progressive or liberal branch of the government is. What I really want people to pay attention to are the inducements and motivations that the candidates are going to use to encourage people to participate. Are they using promises of benefits or fear to motivate? What do the campaigns believe is going to attract voters to them? That message reads into the actual ethic of a campaign. Are they trying to scare people or are they trying to bribe people? That's the two main ways you cause action in voters, and we're going to see both sides use both tactics to generate a win.
With that, we will leave you for what will be an politically exciting year, 2024, leading up to the general presidential election. We're going to keep it right here on Atlanta News First Plus with continuing coverage. At 1 o'clock, join us as we have political expert and Kennesaw State University professor Dr. Ben Taylor join us with some more analysis looking ahead into the political future of the Democratic and Republican Party. Stick with us. We'll be right back.